times. So we're going to talk about the Indigenous Community Support Fund. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but what it is the funding the federal government rolled out to help with expenses related to COVID in 2020. So we're going to go through the fund. We're going to talk about the reporting, and we're also going to touch on the COVID funding overall. So I wanted to say in the first place that it seems like, because this is very new, right? The government had to come up with it on an emergency basis. It's difficult to have detailed instructions and directions from ISC, just difficult to get them. So with this fund in particular, anytime I asked the question about it, the response I got, it's up to Chief and Council. Okay, so I think what that means is that this fund is there to cover, just to provide a pool of money for all kinds of unexpected expenses and additional expenses for COVID. But the eligible expenses guideline is not very strict or very detailed. So we're going to go through the information that's available for now. As time passes, they make more information available. So you may want to, by the time you get to report all your COVID funding, you may want to check with ISC if there is more information available. Okay, so this funding came in a few streams. There was a direct allocation to First Nations in March of last year. Then they also came out with a proposal-based funding for urban and off-reserve Indigenous organizations in May of 2020. Another direct allocation to First Nations and also need-based allocation for off-reserve happened in August of last year. And then there was an additional call for proposals, which was need-based in October of last year, closing on November 30th of last year. So depending what your First Nation or organization did, if it's a First Nation, at the very least, you got the 2 direct allocations. Most of First Nations would also get indirect allocations from their tribal council, who supports in their off-reserve members. And some of us would have applied for those need-based proposals. So that required an actual proposal, and then we received the money for it. Okay. Is that you? Yeah. So now eligible expenses under the fund, again, it's very vague, the information that they provide, which in a way is good, because it means that a lot of different expenses can fall into these categories at the discretion of the leaders. And with your recommendation as program managers or finance people. Okay, so what they listed as funding costs eligible under the this funding stream is support for elders and vulnerable community members, measures to address food insecurity, educational and other support for children, mental health assistance and emergency response services, preparedness measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And then the last point on here actually was in the initial correspondence from the minister, but it's not on their website anymore. So I would suggest we still say that this is applicable, okay? Because it was in the direct allocation to the First Nations, both allocations had it in there. So it said financial assistance for those without work. Okay, which can be very helpful for allocating expenses to that funding. Okay, and then I said here, guidelines aren't very clear. So per ISC, spending is at Chief and Council discretion, as long as it falls within the above categories here on this slide, which a lot of expenses would, right? So when we report for this funding, there are a few things to consider. So most First Nations would have received many different streams of COVID funding. It was not clear until last week, I think, whether it could be carried over. Last week, IST finally said it can be carried over. So this is good news. The concern is how long can we carry it over for, right? So for now, we can carry over to 1 year. So we have a surplus in a certain program, and it also received COVID funding, which adds to our surplus. We probably want to spend that COVID funding ahead of the other funding, if you know what I mean, right? So what I'd like to do is to actually share an example of funding received by a First Nation for different COVID-related streams. So I hope you can see it. Can you see it? Okay, let me make it bigger. Okay, so this is an actual summary one of my First Nations got in February from their FSO from IST. So every First Nation would have got some sort of a summary of all the funding that they've received. Okay, you'll notice it's broken down to year, right? And in 1920, really, it wasn't very much, so probably easy to report. Then the 2021 year had the majority of funding from ISC, and also there is Health Canada funding that came in separately. And so it's very important that we review the entirety of this funding, of this picture, right? Because in reality, lots of the expenses in the last year or in the year that's just ending now are COVID related. Pretty much almost everything we do had some sort of an effect from the pandemic, right? And it's good to keep in mind which programs got that additional funding that need expense allocation for reporting purposes. So in general, I would suggest that Health Canada programs get spent as soon as possible, because in my experience, they like to recover what's not spent somewhat more diligently, so to say. So you may want to look through these programs, and lots of them are self-explanatory, what goes in there, but there is also some information available online, not much of it. So you may want to contact your FSO or your health services officer, the CLO, and ask for information on some of these programs, just the list of eligible expenses and requirements. Okay. For ISC funding, they're normally just give us more leeway with carrying over funds. But again, nobody knows when they're going to want this COVID funding spent. For now, it just carries over 1 year. So if you can have it spent within the current and next year, you should. Okay. You want to review the specific programs that are in here. You'll see that social assistance So your basic needs allocations and special needs allocation are here, right? And with social assistance, it used to be a set contribution program, meaning whatever you didn't spend, you had to return to ISC. They recently changed it to fixed contribution, meaning you can carry over. I am just leery about it, because many of us from First Nations have been through social assistance audits and know that almost every time they result in some recovery. So I would say pay special attention to those programs that they're more likely to recover from, and then make sure that there is enough expenses in your reporting allocated to these programs. Okay. So that's about it. Lots of it is just additional funding for your regular programs. And, it shouldn't really be too hard to probably find some additional expenses to allocate there. But really get a good understanding of how much in total and which programs have priority for expense allocation there. Just going back to our presentation. Okay, so we said review all COVID funding received by the First Nation. If you didn't receive a summary, ask for it. Allocate COVID-related costs to specific programs first. So this is what we talked about. So if you spent, if you gave food hampers to all your community members, make sure that the ones that are on social assistance, you allocate that to social assistance, right? As opposed to having it in this general fund. And remaining costs after you allocate to specific programs can be reported for this Indigenous Community Support Fund. If a program was affected by COVID, review program costs for allocation to program funding. Like really be, inquisitive and creative in reviewing your programs, because many of the costs were affected by COVID, right? And many of the costs, even though they were there before, they still got affected by COVID. For an example, if you have a band-owned business that had to close, like in one of my First Nations, the VLTs had to close, but Chief and Council made the decision to still keep paying wages for the VLT workers while the business was closed. We can still try and allocate those wages to this Indigenous Community Support Fund, because if you remember, the last point in the eligible expenses was supporting people without work, right? So be very creative and inquisitive when you review the expenses. I'm gonna check the chat here. For summary requests, does FNIB provide the summary if requested? So in my experience, I received my summary for both ISC and FNIB from the FSO, so from ISC. But I'm sure if you contact your CLO, or I'm not sure what they're called now, I think they're still CLO at FNIB, I'm sure they'll be able to provide theirs separately. The spreadsheet that you saw separated, right, ISC funding and FNIB funding, and that came from ISC. For 2 communities that I work with, it was similar. So I'm assuming they just were on a mission to send it out to everyone, and hopefully your community received it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so then carryover of COVID funding is allowed. That's a recent decision. So for now, we know it's just 1 year, so let's spend it, right? Let's just try and allocate expenses, because like I said, everything is affected by COVID, right? And really the guidelines very vague. They're not very specific, which means we can be creative and inclusive with allocating expenses. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to go to the next one. Okay, so then I've included program guidelines here. You can read them. For now, they're not very detailed. I honestly didn't get much information from there. But what you may want to do is just keep checking in, because hopefully they will update with more detailed information. And if they don't, that's actually a good thing, because it means the allocation of expenses to this fund still remains pretty open, right? For instance, if we're spending in a specific program, then it's very program specific expenses, right? But if this is a general fund without very specific guidelines, then we can allocate the remaining expenses there. Okay, so now I'd like to go over the activities and expenditure report for this program. And this one is actually, we're able to see all of it. Okay, so what you will notice is this is a very general report. So this is a general activities and expenditures report for ISC. They didn't have time to create a specific one for the program, which just supports that there isn't much information. It could be a good thing, because like I said, it's more open to different kinds of expenditures allocated to it, as long as it's related to COVID-19 and its leadership's decision. Okay, so this one is a pretty short and easy to understand report. So we'll have, under the recipient name, we'll have our First Nation or organization, and then under recipient number, our First Nation number. And then you'll notice that under program, there is a list of programs here, and I couldn't find this Indigenous Community Support Fund in here, but I looked at it late at night. So if you can find it, then maybe I missed it. I don't think it's here. Okay. And the report is on Capacity Connect website. You can download it. But basically, I don't think it's here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to click the other and then put in here Indigenous Community Support Fund. Okay. Contact information is just our contact, whoever completes the form. Project information, project name, you can name it Community Support -COVID-19, whatever makes sense. Project number, you don't have to worry about it unless your First Nation assigns numbers to the project. Activity report, so that would be for 2020-21. And then provide a brief description of the activity. So what I normally do and suggest that people do is create an Excel spreadsheet or some sort of just a summary of activities that I'm claiming, or just costs that I'm claiming, right? And those costs would help me if I just have what the costs are, like say food hampers for community members, right? Then it would help me describe the activity. Okay, I don't think we need to go all the way out here just because it's a general report. We can just say here community support activities during the pandemic, right? And maybe give a little more details. So if the activity was completed within the period identified above, enter the date the activity was completed. I would just enter the year end, right? Because whatever activity continues, it's with the carryover funds. It's not what we are reporting. If the activity was not completed within the period identified above, please explain why it was not completed and describe any work completed within the period. So we have a carryover for that fund. Maybe we want to mention it here, that additional community support activities are ongoing because the pandemic crisis is still there, right? List any deliverables associated with this activity that are specified in the recipient's funding agreement and attached if completed. So we didn't really get a funding agreement here, did we? So I think we would just keep it general and would say community support during the pandemic and see the attached cost summary. Provide additional comments you would like to share regarding this activity. So if you like to, please do. And so in here, we have the option to just have a general, or when we prepare our summary and there's different costs, like say elders support, people without work support, food hampers for the community, maybe some isolation costs that you didn't allocate to other programs, then you can add them separately as an activity. Sometimes it's just easier. So you would just list in here isolation for like as required by pandemic regulations, right? If this is a final report, describe the final outcomes and highlights. So it's only a final report if you spent all your funding, right? If you're carrying it over, it's not a final report. So, and the outcomes again, I think because we don't have a contribution agreement or specific guidelines, we can just say here, community received the required support during the pandemic. Okay, so here is our expenditure report. And so when we prepare our summary in Excel or in any other way, we would have those line items. So our costs, their description and the total cost. And so here we can just add it in here. So it has budget amount and expenditure amount. Normally, I would still enter the budget amount, which could equal the expenditure amount. I think for this particular one, if we didn't have a budget, it was an emergency funding, we're probably okay not entering the budget amount. But say, for instance, if I spent, I don't know, $105,000 on food hampers, and maybe it's $105,771, right? I could put 105,000 even in the budget amount, just because budget amounts are normally even. All right, it's up to you though. I'm sure if we leave it blank here, it's not going to be a problem. They just want to see what we spent the funding on. Okay, now in-kind sources, if applicable, I don't think we should worry about this one here. It's with proposals or contribution agreement that include in-kind. This is important. Here it's not, because we have to spend the actual cash, right? This report is about what we did with the actual money that was deposited into our account. Okay, supporting document if applicable. So in here we can just attach the Excel spreadsheet or whatever summary we have. We also can choose not to, because it's all detailed here in the budget items. Okay, and then the last thing is our declaration and date, and we're done. So that's it for the Indigenous Community Support Fund. I'm going to
sign. Thanks for the sign.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
So here are the contacts for all of us here. If you have any questions afterwards, but if you have any questions right now,